Human, can you pretend to be my father for one night? The little alien girl asked quietly. The valley looked like a place the universe had forgotten to ruin. Rolling green hills stretched beneath endless spring sunlight, layered one after another like waves frozen in emerald silk. White flowers trembled in the breeze. Snow still clung to the distant mountain peaks, glowing silver beneath drifting clouds. Small rivers cut through the valleys like veins of glass, and somewhere far away, bells from grazing livestock echoed softly across the hills. To most travelers, it looked peaceful. To the human mechanic sitting alone beside a broken weather tower, it felt painfully empty. He tightened a rusted bolt with oil-stained hands while warm wind brushed through his dark hair. His leather jacket hung open at the collar, worn from years of storms and hard roads. Beside him lay scattered tools, old power cells, and the half-disassembled shell of a farming drone that no longer wanted to live. The mechanic had spent the last 4 years in the valley repairing machines no one else cared enough to fix. Water pumps, solar fences, cargo crawlers, broken harvest engines. Anything quiet enough to keep him away from cities. Away from people. Especially away from memories. The nearby alien settlements tolerated him because he was useful, but nobody truly welcomed him. Humans still carried the shadow of the border wars, and though peace treaties had ended the fighting years ago, scars remained longer than governments did. He preferred it that way. Machines broke for simple reasons. People didn't. The mechanic wiped grease from his fingers and reached for another tool when he felt it again. That strange sensation. Being watched. Slowly, he lifted his eyes toward the hills. There, half hidden among the tall grass and white flowers, stood the little alien girl. She couldn't have been older than 8. Tiny. Thin. Almost fragile against the endless valley. Her pale blue skin shimmered softly beneath the sunlight, faint silver patterns glowing beneath her cheeks like frozen rivers under ice. Long silver-white hair drifted around her shoulders in the spring wind, and her enormous glowing blue eyes remained fixed on him with cautious curiosity. In one hand she clutched a small metal pail tightly against her chest. The mechanic frowned slightly. This was the 4th day in a row he'd seen her. Always watching. Never speaking. The moment their eyes met, she startled like a frightened deer. Then she turned and disappeared back into the hills. He exhaled quietly. "Kid's gonna break her neck running through those rocks someday," he muttered. But strangely, he found himself glancing toward the hills long after she was gone. The next morning, she returned. This time she stood closer. Not close enough to speak. Just close enough to watch him work. The mechanic pretended not to notice. He continued repairing the weather tower while birds drifted overhead beneath the warm afternoon sky. Every now and then, he caught the child peeking from behind wildflowers, her silver hair glowing softly beneath the sunlight. Hours passed before he finally sighed. "You planning to stand there all day?" The little girl froze instantly. Her wide eyes blinked in panic. For a moment, it looked as though she might flee again. Instead, she lowered her gaze toward the grass. "You fix broken things," she whispered quietly. Her voice was soft. Almost musical. The mechanic leaned back against the tower. "Usually." She hesitated. Then slowly lifted the metal pail she carried. The handle was broken clean through. "I dropped it near the river." The mechanic stared at the pail for a moment before holding out his hand. She approached cautiously, step by careful step, like someone who had learned the world was dangerous long before childhood should have taught her that lesson. Up close, he noticed how small she really was. And how tired her eyes looked. Not physically tired. Lonely tired. The kind adults carried after funerals. Not children. He took the pail carefully, and examined the broken handle. "Cheap weld," he said. "Whoever made this rushed it." The little girl watched him nervously. "You can fix it?" "Probably." Hope flickered across her face so suddenly it almost hurt to look at. The mechanic grabbed a small repair torch from his toolkit, and sat cross-legged beside the tower, while the child remained nearby in complete silence. She watched everything. The sparks. The tools. The way his hands moved. The tiny crease between his brows whenever he concentrated. Nobody had watched him like that in years. After several minutes, he handed the repaired pail back to her. There. The little girl stared at it like he'd handed her treasure. A tiny smile appeared. Small. Shy. But real. Thank you, human. He gave a faint shrug. Don't drop it again. For the first time, a quiet laugh escaped her lips. It was soft enough to vanish into the wind. But somehow, the sound lingered after she walked away through the hills. Days passed. Then weeks. Spring deepened across the valley. And somehow, without either of them meaning to, a strange routine formed between the lonely mechanic and the mysterious alien child. She began appearing almost every afternoon. Sometimes she brought flowers and left them awkwardly near his workshop door before pretending she hadn't. Sometimes she simply sat nearby while he repaired machinery. Other times she asked small questions. What's this tool for? Why do engines overheat? Why do humans drink bitter coffee if it tastes bad? He answered more often than he intended to. The valley settlers eventually noticed. She shouldn't be wandering alone, one farmer muttered one evening while picking up repaired parts from the mechanic's shop. Where's her family? The mechanic asked casually. The farmer's expression darkened immediately. No one knows. That answer bothered him more than it should have. Others offered only whispers. The girl lived in the mountains. Her mother rarely appeared. Some believed the family once belonged to old alien nobility before the war. Others warned him quietly to stay away from the child altogether. People ask questions about that family, one trader said nervously. What kind of questions? The trader avoided his eyes. The dangerous kind. One evening, rain clouds drifted low across the mountains while golden sunset lights spilled across the valley like fire. The mechanic closed his workshop early after finishing repairs on a damaged cargo crawler. As he locked the door, he noticed the little girl standing near the fence waiting for him. But tonight felt different. She looked nervous. More nervous than usual. Her small hands twisted tightly around the metal pail. You okay, kid? She swallowed hard. Our heater stopped working. The mechanic glanced toward the darkening hills. You live far? A little. He sighed quietly. Normally, he avoided visiting settlements. Avoided homes. Avoided people's lives. But something in her expression stopped him from refusing. All right, he said. Lead the way. Relief flooded her face instantly. The two of them crossed through flowering hills beneath the fading light of sunset. Wind rolled gently through the grass while distant mountain rivers shimmered below. As they walked, the mechanic noticed something strange. The little girl constantly checked behind them, as if afraid someone might be following. Eventually, hidden among tall white blossom trees near the mountains, the cabin appeared. The mechanic slowed immediately. This wasn't some poor village shack. Though small, the home carried traces of old wealth. Elegant alien carvings framed the doorway. Faded silver banners hung beside the windows. Strange royal-looking symbols decorated the wooden beams above the porch. Inside, the mystery deepened. Ancient books. Old ceremonial fabrics. A cracked holographic portrait turned face down on a shelf. The place felt less like a home, and more like someone hiding from the world. You live here alone? He asked carefully. The little girl lowered her eyes. My mother travels sometimes. Something about the answer felt rehearsed. The mechanic repaired the damaged heating system while the child quietly prepared tea at the small kitchen table. Outside, night slowly covered the valley. But tension had begun creeping through the cabin like cold smoke. The little girl kept glancing toward the windows. Toward the hills. Toward the darkness outside. Finally, after several long minutes of silence, she spoke again. Human. He looked up from the heater. Her tiny fingers trembled around her teacup. Her glowing eyes looked terrified. Can you pretend to be my father, for one night? The mechanic stared at her. For a moment, the room became completely silent except for the faint crackle of the heater behind him. What? Before she could answer, lights suddenly appeared beyond the hills outside. Bright white beams moving through the darkness. Vehicles. Several of them. The little girl's face turned pale with fear. They came early, she whispered. The mechanic slowly stood. Outside, engines echoed through the valley as the approaching lights climbed closer toward the isolated cabin. Then the child grabbed his sleeve tightly. And for the first time since meeting her, he realized she was truly afraid. The first transport vehicle arrived like a blade cutting through the quiet valley night. Its silver lights swept across the hills, turning flowers and tall grass ghostly white beneath the darkness. Heavy engines hummed softly as 3 sleek armored carriers stopped outside the isolated cabin beneath the mountain trees. The little alien girl instantly moved closer to the human mechanic. Not casually. Desperately. Her tiny fingers wrapped around the sleeve of his jacket as though letting go might destroy the last piece of safety she had left. The mechanic felt her trembling. Outside, doors hissed open. Tall figures emerged beneath the pale moonlight. Alien guards in dark ceremonial armor spread across the property with disciplined precision, while several elegant officials approached the cabin steps beneath flowing silver robes marked with glowing royal insignias. The mechanic's eyes narrowed slightly. This wasn't a family visit. This was political. Inside the cabin, panic flickered across the child's face. "You have to stay close," she whispered urgently. "Please." The mechanic crouched slightly to meet her eyes. "Kid," he said quietly, "who exactly are these people?" Before she could answer, a sharp knock echoed against the cabin door. 3 measured strikes. Formal. Controlled. Dangerous. The little girl flinched. Then, with heartbreaking instinct, she reached for his hand. The mechanic stared down at her tiny fingers gripping his rough oil-stained palm. Something tightened painfully in his chest. He hadn't held someone's hand in years. Another knock came. One of the guards outside spoke calmly through the door. "Your Highness, we know you are awake." The mechanic's expression changed instantly. "Your Highness." The little girl lowered her head. And suddenly, every strange detail about the cabin made horrifying sense. The royal symbols. The hidden location. The whispers in the valley. The fear in her eyes. The mechanic exhaled slowly. "Your royalty?" The child gave the smallest nod imaginable. Then she whispered the words almost shamefully. "My mother was queen." Silence filled the room. Outside, the officials waited patiently beneath the cold mountain wind while distant thunder rolled beyond the peaks. The mechanic rubbed a hand across his jaw. "You might have mentioned that earlier. I was scared you would leave." The honesty in her voice struck harder than the revelation itself. Another knock. More impatient this time. The little girl looked at him with panic rising in her glowing blue eyes. "If they know I'm alone, they'll take me away." The mechanic frowned. "Take you where?" "To the capital." The way she said the words sounded less like a city, and more like a prison. Outside, a female voice finally spoke through the door. "Your Highness, we received reports of unauthorized movement near the border regions. Please open the door so we may ensure your safety." Safety. The mechanic had spent enough years around soldiers and governments to know how dangerous that word could become. The little girl stepped even closer. Then quietly. "Please pretend." Her voice nearly broke. "Just for tonight." The mechanic looked toward the door. Then toward the terrified child holding onto him like she was drowning. Something old and buried shifted painfully inside him. Against his better judgment, he nodded once. Relief flooded her face so suddenly it almost looked like she might cry. The mechanic opened the cabin door. Cold night air swept inside immediately. The officials outside fell silent the moment they saw him standing there. Confusion spread visibly across several faces. One older alien man stepped forward slowly, his silver robes moving softly in the wind. His sharp golden eyes studied the human mechanic carefully. "And you are?" The mechanic leaned casually against the doorway. "Her father." The lie landed heavily. Several guards exchanged immediate glances. One woman near the transport vehicles visibly stiffened. The older official's expression remained calm, but suspicion darkened his gaze. We were unaware the child's guardian had returned. Been away working outer settlements, the mechanic replied smoothly. The little girl quietly stepped beside him and wrapped both arms around his side. Not performatively. Not theatrically. Naturally. Like she had wanted to do it for a very long time. The officials noticed. And somehow, that simple gesture unsettled them more than the lie itself. The older official bowed his head politely. May we enter? The mechanic stepped aside reluctantly. The cabin slowly filled with elegant strangers, armored guards, and the cold scent of rain drifting in from the mountains. The warmth of the small home vanished almost instantly beneath the weight of political tension. The little girl never let go of the mechanic's sleeve. Not once. Dinner became an interrogation disguised as politeness. The officials sat around the candlelit table beneath faded royal fabrics while servants unpacked ceremonial containers of food brought from the transports outside. The mechanic hated every second of it. Questions came carefully. Calculated. Where exactly have you been stationed these past years? Why did you never formally register guardianship? Why has the child not mentioned you previously? He answered with short, controlled lies while silently studying the room. Some of the visitors appeared suspicious. Others looked strangely relieved. One younger woman seated near the fireplace kept glancing toward the little girl with obvious sympathy. Another official barely looked at the child at all, treating her less like a person and more like a political object already being measured and weighed. The mechanic noticed everything. Years of surviving war zones had trained him to read rooms quickly. And this room felt dangerous. Throughout dinner, the little alien girl remained close beside him, almost afraid he might disappear if she stopped touching him for even a moment. At one point, a tall official asked her gently, "Your Highness, why have you never spoken of your father before?" The child lowered her eyes toward the table. Then quietly answered, "Because I thought he wasn't coming back." The mechanic felt something twist sharply in his chest. The room fell silent. No one questioned her further. Hours passed. Rain eventually began falling outside, soft at first, then heavier against the cabin roof. The tension inside only deepened. The mechanic noticed armed guards posted around every window now. More transports arriving. More whispers. Something larger was happening here. Late into the evening, the little girl quietly tugged on his sleeve. "Come!" He allowed her to lead him briefly away from the gathering into a smaller room near the back of the cabin. The space was clearly hers. Tiny handmade star maps covered one wall. Small carved animal figures sat beside old books. Drawings were scattered across a wooden desk beneath the window. The mechanic froze when he noticed them. Family drawings. Crude childish sketches. In nearly every picture stood the little alien girl, beside a tall human man. His throat tightened unexpectedly. "You drew these?" She nodded nervously. "I didn't know what fathers looked like." The words landed like a knife. The mechanic slowly sat down beside the desk. The child picked up one drawing carefully. In it, the imaginary human father carried her on his shoulders beneath a field of stars. Her voice became very small. "Do fathers really carry children when they fall asleep?" The mechanic stared at the drawing for a long moment before answering quietly. "Yeah." She looked at him carefully. "Would a real father stay, even if the child wasn't his?" For several seconds he couldn't speak. Because suddenly, the lonely cabin, the frightened child, the tiny hopeful drawings, all of it was breaking through walls inside him he thought had been buried forever. Finally, he answered honestly. "The good ones would." The little girl smiled softly. Not the shy, uncertain smile from the hills. This one carried warmth, trust, hope, and somehow that terrified him more than the armed guards outside. Near midnight, the gathering finally began settling. Several officials prepared temporary sleeping quarters while guards rotated patrols around the property. The mechanic stepped outside briefly onto the rain-covered porch to clear his head. Cold mountain wind hit his face instantly. From inside the cabin, he could hear the little girl laughing quietly with one of the kinder servants, for the first time all evening. The sound felt fragile, like something the world could steal too easily. As he moved around the side of the cabin, voices suddenly stopped him. Two officials stood partially hidden beneath the trees near one of the transports. The capital wants her transferred before the month ends. She's too visible here. And the human? A pause. Then coldly. If necessary, he can be removed from the arrangement later. The mechanic's expression hardened immediately. Arrangement. That was all the child was to them. An arrangement. A throne. A symbol. Not a frightened little girl drawing imaginary fathers by candlelight. Thunder rolled across the mountains again. The mechanic slowly stepped back into the shadows before they noticed him. Inside the cabin, firelight flickered warmly through the windows. And for the first time in years, he realized he genuinely did not want these people taking her away. Much later, long after midnight, the storm deepened across the valley. Most of the officials had gone to sleep. The little alien girl eventually fell asleep too. Not in her room. Beside him. Curled carefully against his side near the fireplace while clutching the sleeve of his jacket tightly in her small hand. As if even unconscious, she feared he might vanish. The mechanic sat awake in silence while rain hammered softly against the windows. He looked down at the child sleeping peacefully beside him. And something dangerous happened. For the first time in years, the loneliness inside him eased. Just slightly. Then suddenly, movement outside. The mechanic's eyes sharpened instantly. Far beyond the rain-covered hills, dark figures moved silently between the trees surrounding the cabin. Armed. Watching. Closing in. And immediately, every instinct he had from the war returned at once. Rain hammered the mountains like falling stones. Cold wind tore through the valley while thunder rolled above the cliffs, shaking the hidden cabin beneath the flowering trees. The peaceful green hills that had once glowed beneath spring sunlight now looked wild and dangerous beneath flashes of silver lightning. Inside the cabin, the fire had nearly died. Most of the officials slept uneasily in temporary rooms while guards rotated positions around the property. But the human mechanic no longer felt tired. Every instinct inside him screamed the same warning. Something was coming. Fast. He carefully lifted the little alien girl's hand from his jacket sleeve and stood from beside the fireplace. Even asleep, she frowned softly the moment contact disappeared, as though abandonment haunted her dreams. The mechanic quietly crossed the darkened room toward the window. Another flash of lightning split the mountains. And this time he saw them clearly. Figures moving through the rain. Armed. Too disciplined to be bandits. Too quiet to be ordinary soldiers. The mechanic's expression hardened instantly. Attackers. He moved toward the nearest sleeping guard and shook him awake without hesitation. Get up. The alien soldier blinked in confusion. What? Perimeters compromised. The words barely left his mouth before a deafening explosion tore through the night. The front security barrier erupted in blue sparks outside the cabin as screams echoed through the storm. Guards shouted warnings while gunfire suddenly erupted beyond the hills. The little alien girl woke instantly with a terrified gasp. The mechanic turned toward her just as another explosion shattered part of the outer fence. Panic exploded throughout the cabin. Officials stumbled from rooms in ceremonial robes while guards grabbed weapons and rushed outside into the rain. Emergency red lights flickered through the cabin as power systems partially failed. The little girl looked completely frozen with fear. Human! The mechanic crossed the room immediately and grabbed her small shoulders firmly. Listen to me, he said calmly. Stay behind me no matter what happens. Understand? She nodded shakily. Outside, more gunfire cracked through the valley. The older silver-robed official burst into the room, breathing hard. They breached the western ridge! Another guard shouted from outside. There are too many! The mechanic looked through the rain-covered window again, quickly assessing the situation. The attackers weren't aiming randomly. They were moving toward one place only. The child. One of the younger officials turned pale. They came for her. The mechanic didn't wait for further discussion. Back exit, he ordered immediately. Several officials looked stunned. You are not authorized to command. Then stay here and die arguing. Silence. The mechanic grabbed a rifle from a wounded guard and checked the power chamber with practiced speed. Years vanished from his face instantly. The lonely valley mechanic disappeared. And for the first time in a very long while, the soldier returned. Move, he ordered coldly. No one argued again. Rain lashed violently across the mountains as the group escaped through the rear side of the cabin into the dark hills beyond. Lightning flashed overhead while distant blaster fire illuminated the valley behind them in violent bursts of blue-white light. The little alien girl struggled to keep pace through the mud and rocks. Without hesitation, the mechanic lifted her into his arms. She wrapped both arms tightly around his neck immediately. Thunder shook the mountains again. The child buried her face against his shoulder. And despite the chaos, the mechanic realized she trusted him completely. That realization terrified him more than the gunfire. Behind them, explosions swallowed portions of the cabin grounds while guards fought desperately to delay the attackers. One official stumbled through the rain beside the mechanic. There's an emergency transport hidden near the eastern cliffs, she shouted over the storm. If we reach it. A blast suddenly erupted nearby. The ground exploded beside them in flying dirt and stone. The mechanic instinctively shielded the little girl with his body as several attackers emerged through the rain ahead. Dark armor. Masked helmets. Professional killers. The mechanic shoved the officials behind a cluster of rocks. Stay down! Gunfire erupted instantly. The mechanic moved with terrifying efficiency through the storm, firing controlled shots while dragging the child safely behind cover. Rain soaked his jacket completely while mud splashed beneath heavy boots and flashes of energy weapons lit the darkness around them. The little girl stared at him with wide glowing eyes. Not with fear. With awe. As though the imaginary protector from her drawings had suddenly become real. The attackers slowly fell back beneath the mechanic's resistance, but more shapes continued moving through the hills. Too many. Far too many. The older official looked horrified. How are they tracking us? No one answered. Because deep down, they already knew. Someone inside the royal network had betrayed the child. Hours seemed to pass beneath the storm. Eventually, the group reached an abandoned stone shelter hidden along the mountain cliffs. Wind howled through the narrow pass outside while rain battered the ancient walls. For a brief moment, they were safe. The little alien girl sat wrapped in a thermal blanket beside the mechanic, while the surviving officials argued quietly across the shelter. She must be transported off-world immediately. The capital is compromised. We don't even know who arranged this attack. The mechanic ignored them. His attention remained on the child. She looked exhausted. Small hands trembling slightly around a metal cup of heated water. Finally, she looked up at him carefully. You came back for me. The mechanic frowned slightly. Of course I did. As if it were obvious. The little girl lowered her eyes. Most people leave. The simplicity of the statement hit harder than any battlefield memory ever had. The mechanic sat beside her in silence for several moments while rain echoed through the mountain pass outside. Then quietly. Why me? She blinked. You knew my name before we met. The child hesitated nervously. Finally, she reached beneath her blanket and removed a tiny silver pendant hanging around her neck. Inside was an old faded holographic image. The mechanic froze instantly. It showed a much younger version of himself wearing military engineering armor during the war. Beside him stood an elegant alien woman with silver eyes and dark ceremonial clothing. The little girl watched his expression carefully. My mother kept that picture. The mechanic stared at the image in stunned silence. Memories crashed into him all at once. Smoke-filled battlefields. Collapsed evacuation ships. A wounded alien officer refusing to abandon civilians during bombardment. The woman in the photograph. The Queen. Years ago, during the final months of the war, he had saved her life without ever learning who she truly was. The little girl's voice became soft. She used to tell me stories about a human soldier who stayed behind to save strangers when everyone else ran away. The mechanic looked down at the pendant. His chest tightened painfully. She searched for you for years, the child whispered. After she disappeared, I searched too. Thunder rolled softly outside. The mechanic suddenly understood everything. The hills. The watching. The tiny repaired pail. The hopeful drawings. She had never approached him by accident. She had been looking for him from the beginning. The little girl carefully moved closer beside him. I thought, she whispered nervously, maybe if you met me, you wouldn't leave either. Something inside the mechanic broke quietly in that moment. Not violently. Not dramatically. Just the slow collapse of a wall held up for too many lonely years. He gently placed a hand against the child's silver-white hair. And for the first time, she smiled without fear. Near dawn, the storm finally began weakening. Pale gray light slowly touched the mountains while surviving guards prepared the hidden transport vessel beyond the cliffs. The officials moved urgently now. The attack had changed everything. One younger advisor approached carefully. We must leave before sunrise. The little alien girl immediately stiffened beside the mechanic. Fear returned to her eyes. Not fear of attackers this time. Fear of separation. The mechanic noticed instantly. So that's it? He asked coldly. You drag her across the galaxy and lock her in another palace? The advisor looked uncomfortable. She is the last heir of the royal bloodline. She is a child. She is both. The little girl quietly grabbed the mechanic's sleeve again. Exactly like she had beside the fireplace hours earlier. Only now, he didn't want her letting go either. As the transport engine slowly powered on beyond the cliffs, the child finally looked up at him with trembling eyes. When morning comes, she whispered, do you still have to pretend? The question shattered what remained of his defenses. The mechanic looked at her for a long moment, while cold dawn wind moved through the mountains around them. Then finally, no. Tears instantly filled her glowing blue eyes. The mechanic crouched in front of her carefully. I'm done pretending. The child threw her arms around him before he even finished speaking. He held her tightly against his chest while sunrise slowly spilled gold across the green valley below. And at that exact moment, new engines echoed across the mountains. Everyone turned sharply. A massive royal ship emerged through the clouds above the valley, silver wings glowing beneath the dawn. The officials stared upward in stunned disbelief. One whispered shakily, The Queen! The ship descended slowly beyond the cliffs while royal guards poured outward in disciplined formation. Then she appeared. Tall. Elegant. Wrapped in dark silver robes that moved softly in the morning wind. The alien queen. Alive. The little girl gasped softly beside the mechanic. Then ran. Mother! The queen dropped to her knees just as the child collided into her arms. Both held each other tightly while years of grief, fear, and separation finally broke apart beneath the rising sun. Several officials looked close to tears themselves. But after a long moment, the queen slowly lifted her eyes toward the mechanic. Recognition struck instantly. You! The mechanic gave a faint tired nod. The queen stared at him, almost in disbelief. The human from the battlefield. Neither spoke for several seconds. Then the little girl grabbed both their hands together with desperate determination. And suddenly, the queen understood everything. Not just the attack. Not just the protection. But the way her daughter looked at him. Safe. Loved. No longer alone. The queen's expression softened deeply. You stayed. The mechanic looked toward the child standing between them. Yeah, he answered quietly. I did. Several days later, peace slowly returned to the valley. Spring sunlight once again covered the hills in gold and green while rivers sparkled beneath the mountains. Near the repaired workshop beside the weather tower, the mechanic tightened bolts on an old farming drone while warm wind rolled through the flowers. Nearby, the little alien girl ran laughing through the grass with her tiny metal pail swinging wildly in her hand. No fear. No hiding. No lonely silence. Every few seconds she glanced back toward him just to make sure he was still there. And every single time, he was.